Okay, so good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, depending on where you tune in to this Tel Aviv University event. I am Udi Sommer from the Political Science Department and the Center for the Study of the United States at Tel Aviv with the Fulbright program. I am delighted to open this webinar about the aftermath of the 2020 US presidential election, which is going to examine political, cyber, and strategic aspects of those consequential elections. The webinar is broadcast via Zoom, via social media, and also on the Jerusalem Post website. We have an exciting program, which is a product of a first and hopefully not last collaboration between multiple research centers and institutes at the Faculty of Social Sciences at Tel Aviv University. This includes the Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, the Boris Mintz Institute for Strategic Policy Solutions to Global Challenges, the Checkpoint Institute for Information Security, and the Center for the Study of the United States with the Fulbright program. In developing this program, we also benefited from our close collaboration with partners and friends across campus and around the world. That includes the law school, the Faculty of Humanities, the business school, and the offices of the president and the vice president. It is my true pleasure to welcome Provost Steif to open the event. Provost Steif, please.
Thank you. Thank you. Good morning, evening, afternoon to everyone. I have to apologize in advance because I will not be able to stay for the entire event, but it is an honor to be here. As director of Tel Aviv University, I put high premium on multidisciplinary research and collaboration between different faculties and academic units. Hence, it is my honor and pleasure to open this webinar, which is co-organized by three leading Tel Aviv University research bodies, the Boris Mintz Institute, the Center for the Study of the United States, and the Yuval Ne'eman Workshop for Science, Technology, and Security. This interesting webinar will examine the implications and effects of the last US presidential elections from several angles: policy, cyber, strategy, diplomacy. Of our four distinguished guests, I would like to extend special thanks to Professor Lee Epstein of Washington University in St. Louis, who is certainly one of the most knowledgeable scholars of the US Supreme Court, as I've learned. And thanks of course are due to our own distinguished faculty, Professor Itamar Rabinovich, Professor Itzik Ben Israel, and Dr. Yael Sternhardt. So I wish us all an enriching listening. Once again, I apologize that I will not be able to stay for the entire event, but the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Steif. And the nice thing about doing Zoom events, I mean, we don't meet each other, but you can also always watch the recording. So that's the upside. And it is now my pleasure to welcome the head of the Boris Mintz Institute and Dean of Social Sciences, Professor Itai Sened, to give an opening statement. I'd like to stress that without Dean Sened's support, this event would not be possible. Dean Sened, thank you so much, please.
Thank you so much to all. This is indeed one of the things we wish to develop at the Faculty of Social Sciences. I cannot go on without just very few words of thanks to Professor Lee Epstein, a very close friend for many, many years. Thank you so much for joining us on such a short notice. I've also just heard that Professor Epstein will enrich our students with a special seminar organized by the Center for the Study of the United States, headed by Udi Sommer. Sommer or Sommer, I'm not sure. Anyway, thank you so much for doing that. This is really an outstanding opportunity to have such a scholar at this webinar and talking to our students directly on issues of the US Supreme Court. So thank you so much. More generally, as Udi mentioned earlier, this is a first, but definitely not the last. We're going to have a few upcoming such events. One in March with our collaborator institute from Kenya, the ISIPE, on the evolution of sustainable agriculture, and some others still in the making. It is I believe we are getting close to the end of the coronavirus era and the beginning of better times. But I'm sure that this webinar and other new ways to communicate will stay with us and will really enable us to enrich our students with such discussions of such outstanding scholars like Itamar, Lee, Yael, and Itzik, who are rare experts in their fields. And in the past, it was always somewhat difficult to get our students to listen to such an enriching discussion so timely as we are just concluding the actual events and getting ready to the inauguration of the new president-elect in the United States. So given how excited I am about what is to follow, I will stop here. Thank you all for coming. And Udi, please continue with the event. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dean Sennett. It is a delight to have such a diverse panel to discuss the US presidential elections from various disciplinary perspectives and viewpoints. We have no more than an hour, and thus, while each of our panelists is an extremely accomplished scholar, I will introduce each of them briefly and by title only. I have a question that I sent to each of them in advance. They will have approximately 10 minutes each to address. After their presentations, after their 4 presentations, we will have a brief discussion on the panel. We will also make every effort to make time to take a limited number of questions from the audience, which you can enter on the chat or the Q&A functions on your Zoom or social media interface. Our first speaker is Professor Itamar Rabinovich. Professor Rabinovich is the former ambassador of Israel to the United States and President Emeritus of Tel Aviv University. Professor Rabinovich, thanks for being us today. The Abraham Accords changed the status of the Palestinian issue. It further established and formalized regional alliances of Israel and the Sunni powers and backed Iran into a tight corner. Are the Abraham Accords a true paradigm shift? To what extent will they constrain the Biden administration's foreign policy in the region and force a thorough rethinking of the strategy from the Obama years? And since I sent you this question, little did we know that we were also going to have the recent agreement with Morocco, which might even further complicate the picture. We would love to have your insight on that.
Thank you, Udi. President Biden comes into office next month, looking at the Middle East with 2 legacies. One is of the Obama years, when he was himself vice president and very much involved with the policy, and the 4 years of the Trump period. And while these 2 legacies seem worlds apart, and they are in many respects contradictory, they have one thing in common. Both reflected a tendency on the part of the United States to drift away from the Middle East. The term used by the Obama administration was to pivot away. Of course, anything used by Obama would not be used by Trump, so he never used the term, but he also was interested in reducing US commitment, particularly the military aspect of it, in the Middle East, reflecting the decline of the importance of the oil industry and gas industry in the Middle East compared to US own production, other technologies, and so forth, and a growing concern with China as the main challenge to the US, and hence the view into the Asia-Pacific area. Now, both presidents have dealt with regard to the Middle East with the following issues, not necessarily by order of importance, but say Iran, the conflict with Iran and the quest to deny Iran nuclear weapons. Second, the Israeli-Palestinian issue. And third, relationship with the conservative traditional allies of the United States, and the competition in the region, primarily with Russia, and still on a marginal scale with China. Now, Obama very much wanted to settle the issue with Iran diplomatically, and the result was the JCPOA, the nuclear agreement. It was very controversial at the time, and we know was subsequently the U.S. signature or participation in it was taken back by President Trump. Second, with regard to the Israeli-Palestinian issue, President Obama tried very much himself at the outset, and then delegated it to Secretary Kerry, who very much wanted to do it, tried to negotiate a final status agreement settling the Israeli-Palestinian issue. With regard to the traditional Arab allies, a problematic relationship, President Obama never concealed his contempt for regimes like that of the Saudis, and ambivalence with regard to Mubarak and so forth, the famous or infamous Atlantic interview that he gave to Jeffrey Goldberg. And with regard to the Syrian civil war, the major issue of the middle of the previous decade, he very much did not want to be drawn in, and I think his legacy will for years be marred by the inadequacy or inefficiency of US policy with regard to the Syrian crisis, most famously, the red line line that he drew and Assad crossed, and Obama failed to respond. Now, if we move to Trump, then he reversed the table with regard to Iran. He said, came out of the agreement, and now he imposed sanctions on Iran, was trying very much to bring the Iranian regime to its knees, saying at the same time that he was willing to negotiate, which the Iranians would not do. On the Israeli-Palestinian issue, it took a very pro-Israeli line. I would say pro-right-wing Israel more than Israel in general terms. We all are familiar with the details, and it culminated with the Abraham Accords, about which in a couple of minutes. And of course, he did not stand up to the Russian competitor, and it was under his watch that Russia came back in a big way by intervening successfully in Syria, then in Libya. Russia has become much more of a player in the region as compared to the early years of the Putin period. And Trump's relationship with Russia and Putin is very, very complex, moving from certain personal admiration, refusal, or I would say difficulty to deal with Putin, given the suspicions of collusion during the U.S. elections. With regard to the traditional allies, is not particularly interested in the abuse of human rights and the absence of democracy. And typically for the Trump years, a very personal, almost family relationship between Jared Kushner, his son-in-law, and the two MBS in Saudi Arabia and MBZ in the Emirates. Now, President Trump said from the outset that he would like to negotiate the deal of the century. I think he always wanted very much to receive a Nobel Prize. And I think that's where he saw a potential Nobel Prize. And his efforts in this regard produced, I would say inadvertently, the Abraham Accord. I want to argue in the strongest terms, the Abraham Accord is not what the Trump administration set out to achieve. It was an unintended consequence, but a very successful one. In fact, I think the only foreign policy achievement that Trump can count on his ledger is the normalization process between Israel and Arab countries, combining a willingness to sell F-35 to the Emirates with an identifying an opportunity. The Israeli pressure by Prime Minister Netanyahu to annex parts of the West Bank produced a golden opportunity for a deal. You, the Emirates or the Emiratis, you get suspension of annexation, you get the F-35, and I get normalization with Israel. That, of course, was a big change in the Palestinian-Israeli equation. The Palestinians realized, and I can say that also on the basis of discussions with the Palestinian leaders and activists, they realized that they missed the train, that the rules of the game have changed, that the Arab states are no longer going to wait for them, and they have to adapt their policy. Of course, they wait for the Biden administration to come in. They already are receiving a better treatment. They expect maybe more, and they will seek to maximize, but they understand that the Israeli-Palestinian issue is not going to be first on the agenda, maybe number 5 or number 6. An early quest for final status agreement is not on the agenda, and they will try to get as much as they can. Where the incoming Biden administration does not it does face a complex issue is with regard to Iran. He does want to go back to the JCPOA. He does want to introduce changes in the agreement. I think they may have gotten the sequence wrong. They want to come back into the agreement and then negotiate Iranian concessions. I would say that anyone who graduated from the elementary bazaar knows that you actually do not begin by granting and then asking concessions, but you negotiate the concessions and then you add in what you're willing to grant. This is going to be a major issue in the coming weeks. The Abraham Accords did not quite, I would say, push the Iranians into a corner. It's not good for them. They don't like to see countries in the Gulf allied with Israel. They understand that they may face a more coherent anti-Iranian camp with Israel and several of the pragmatic Sunni states. That's not good for them, but they still do not feel that they are at the corner. In fact, they feel much relieved by the transition now from Trump to Biden. Final word about Turkey. We speak about Iran, Iran, Iran. For many of the Arabs, including in the Gulf, Turkey actually represents a larger threat than Iran. They look at Turkey in Yemen, they look at Turkey present militarily in Qatar, they look at Turkey in the Eastern Mediterranean, and they are worried. So when the lines are drawn, it's not just the pragmatic Arab states, Israel and the United States vis-a-vis Iran, but Turkey has to be put into the equation as well. I think I'll finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Professor Rabinovich. First of all, for meeting the 10-minute mark. And second of all, for the very interesting insights. I was struck by the notion that the Palestinians missed the train. And I was wondering whether you thought there was another train on the way or not. And also by the fact that maybe the #1 challenge for the US foreign policy, the rising power of China around the world, is something that might also have an influence right now, less pronounced, but might also have an influence in the Middle East. But these are just thoughts that we might get back to later on, and I'd be glad to hear your thoughts about that. Thanks again. Our second speaker, Professor Lee Epstein, is Ethan A.H. Shepley Distinguished University Professor at Washington University in St. Louis. Professor Epstein, whereas Chief Justice Roberts made every effort to keep the Supreme Court out of the tumultuous politics of an election year, the Supreme Court repeatedly played a role. In your view, what effect or effects did the presidential election have on the court in terms of the court's composition, in terms of its recent rulings on COVID-19, which were in the news, COVID-19 cases, and finally, in terms of the public's view of the court? Professor Epstein, please.
Thanks, Udi. Hello from St. Louis. I want to thank Udi and Itai Senet, my great and old friends, for inviting me to speak. And last but not least, a shout out to my folks who I think are watching from Florida. Our presidential election, to answer Udi's question, may have had at least two effects on the US Supreme Court. The first concerns the court's composition and its decisions. The second pertains to its structure. Starting with the court's composition, here's our court 3 months ago on September 17th, 2020. I've ordered the justices from most liberal to most conservative. Note that all 4 liberal justices were appointed by Democratic presidents, and the 5 more conservative justices were appointed by Republican presidents. Because it takes 5, a majority, to decide cases, it looks as if the Republican justices have the upper hand and so should prevail almost in all disputes. But that didn't happen in 2020 because the Chief Justice, John Roberts, as Udi noted, sometimes broke from the extreme conservatives joining the Democrats. That was true in last year's ordinary cases, as well as in many important ones on abortion, Trump's financial records, immigration, and gay and transgender rights. In each of these cases, the extreme conservatives dissented, and each was a loss for the Trump administration. But then, on September 18th, 2020, Ruth Bader Ginsburg died just 46 days before the presidential election. Now, the last 2 appointments to the Supreme Court, the Trump appointees Gorsuch and Kavanaugh, took 77 days from nomination by the president to Senate confirmation, which is about average. But in the case of replacing Ginsburg, the Republicans didn't have 77 days before the election. They had only 46. Not wanting to take any chances on the outcome of the election, and certainly not wanting to miss out on the huge opportunity to shift the court to the right and make Roberts irrelevant, Republican leaders, notably Mitch McConnell, vowed to fill Ginsburg's seat. And they did so in near record time with Trump's appointment of Amy Coney Barrett. Now look what the Republicans accomplished. They replaced one of the court's most liberal justices, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, with Barrett, who by all accounts is a rock-solid conservative. Note too, that the center of gravity on the court has now shifted well to the right to the 3 Trump appointees, Kavanaugh, Barrett, and Gorsuch. In other words, almost overnight, the Roberts court morphed into the Trump court. And we in the United States are already beginning to see some effects. In July 2020, when Ginsburg was still on the court, the justices heard a case out of the state of Nevada in which a church asked the court to block enforcement of the state's 50-person cap on religious gatherings. A sharply divided Supreme Court allowed Nevada to enforce its limit and refused the church's request. Note that Chief Justice Roberts joined the Democrats. But without Ginsburg and with Barrett, the court did an about-face just last month, refusing to allow New York to enforce a 25-person occupancy limit on attendance at religious services. The vote was 5-4, with Roberts now in dissent. This may just be the beginning. With Barrett, we may see changes in many areas of the law, religious liberty, of course, and also these. But may is the operative word. Considering that we'll now have a Democratic president and possibly a unified Democratic Congress, the extreme conservatives could become concerned about moving too far, too fast. Perhaps that partially explains the court's speedy and decisive rejection of Texas's request to throw out the election results in 4 key states. But why would the conservative justices be especially worried about overreaching in democratic regime? The answer brings me to the second possible effect of the 2020 election, the threat of structural changes to the court. Because of the rush to confirm Barrett, not to mention the Republicans' refusal to hold hearings for Obama's nominee, Merrick Garland, some Democratic elites and progressives have called for structural changes to the court. This is from the Democratic Party's 2020 platform. Top on the Democrats' reform list is to expand the size of the court, thereby diluting the rock-solid Republican majority. But Democratic reformers face a number of hurdles, not the least of which is public opinion. My colleagues and I recently fielded a survey asking Americans about their support for various court reforms, including expanding the size of the court. It turns out that only 26% of Americans favored the expansion proposal. This was true of Republicans, independents, and believe it or not, Democrats too. So this may not look like a promising picture for reformers who want to increase the court size. But to me, the ball is now in the Supreme Court's court. Should the extreme conservative justices make radical changes to these and other areas of law, they may give the Democratic Party precisely the fodder it needs to make the structural changes some want. We'll see. Thanks.
Professor Epstein, thank you so much. 2 thoughts that came to mind during your presentation. I'll start with the latter one. So if FDR couldn't back the court, will Biden be able to? FDR being such a strong president, so popular with such vast majorities in the legislature. And the second point, you wrote a lot about the watershed event in the Robert Bork failed appointment, right? This was a point where the politics of appointments in the Supreme Court really changed. I was wondering as to your, maybe it's a little early, but as to your intuition, whether the Amy Coney Barrett is another watershed event. The music that you heard during the appointment process in the Amy Coney Barrett appointment, to me, was very different from the music that you were used to hear. The kind of questions that she was asked may have been similar, but her answers were much more direct and right to the point and much less, I would even say that she's a very sophisticated person, but the answers were much less sophisticated than what you heard even in recent cases such as the Obama appointments and even the Trump appointments. I was wondering whether you think this was another major break in the politics of Supreme Court appointments in America. Our third speaker is Professor Itzik Ben Israel, who's a retired Major General in the Israeli Defense Forces. Professor Ben Israel is director of the Blavatnik Interdisciplinary Cyber Research Center, the head of the Yuval Ne'eman Workshop of Science, Technology, and Security at Tel Aviv University. Professor Ben Israel, cybersecurity and the integrity of the electoral process were key takeaways from the US presidential elections in 2016. This has been the topic of news coverage, of federal investigations, and congressional hearings for years after the elections. Yet in 2020, election officials have declared the elections, I quote, the most secure in US history, unquote. This is despite COVID-19 and the logistic complications that the pandemic entailed. So my first question is whether you agree. And my second question, if you do, what was at the basis of this phenomenal improvement? And is there an interesting Israeli angle here? Yes, please.
Well, thank you. You have to distinguish between certain levels of trying to influence the elections by cyberspace. One is a little bit more technical. I mean, there are a lot of machines and computers involved in the a chain of voting, and those machines can be hacked, and then even at the final stage, when you take all the results and feed it into a computer and wait for the summation of the votes, etc. Even then, someone could change the software of this computer and give you a false result. From the point of view of technical hacking, etc., I think there was some difference, huge difference. I'll give you one example immediately between what happened in the previous elections and the recent ones. And then you can say, yes, we did not repeat the same mistakes that we did 4 years ago. But there is another dimension which is much more complicated, and this is using what we call cyberspace in order to influence people to vote in this way or that way. Now, this is something, a very old phenomenon. You can read about it even in the Bible. I mean, people use the technology of spreading rumors at the old time, okay? The same FSB, same intelligence service of Russia today, which before was called KGB, and when it was still Ukraina, before NKVD, and before the revolution, before the communist revolution, used this technology of spreading rumors. At that time, you couldn't do it by tweeting. You had to find another way. And the most known example that we all know about is they fabricated the protocols of the elders of Zion, and we all suffered a lot out of this. And this was more than 100 years ago. Now it can be done more easily because cyberspace enables one to do it. Still, it's not about technology, it's about influencing people, fake news, disinformation, as the Russian call it, etc. And this is something very difficult to handle. First of all, it's very difficult, by the way, to change basic beliefs of people by fake news, although people believe what they want to believe. I mean, if you want to take hardcore of voters of Trump and try to convince them to vote for Hillary Clinton or the other way around, it's very difficult. You can achieve very small percentage of those who will change their minds on really basic beliefs. I'm not thinking about stupid things. Still, if you analyze the situation and you concentrate only on those countries in which 1% here, 2 or 1% there may influence the number of electors that you have, etc., then you can do it. What the Russians did in the previous elections was not something purely this. They did something much more sophisticated, and let me tell you a minute what they did. First of all, they hacked into the computers of the Democratic Party and other leaders of this party, not Hillary by herself, but also other leaders. And they copied huge mass of files from these computers. Secondly, they handed it to the media. Now, the media got this huge number of files without enough time to go file by file and find what are the interesting files. They helped them. Now, in order to help them, they had collaborators, agents in the US that pointed to some files in the huge set of files, especially to false files that were fabricated by the FSB and were put there mainly to emphasize health problem and corruption problem of Hillary Clinton. These were false, but there was not enough time to check them and go to the sources and try to see what is fake here and what is true. And therefore the media reported about them, and this had an influence. It had an influence, as I said, small one, but still it had an influence. After the elections in the US, there were elections in France, and we heard from the man who was in charge of the digital campaign of Macron. He was not president yet. And he told us that he was afraid that the Russians will do the same in France. What he did, I'm not sure, excuse me if it's not legal, but this is what he did. He asked himself, how can I prevent it? So when it happened, I'll tell you immediately what he did. When it happened, and the Russian again hacked into the computers of the Macron's campaign and took those files and sent them to the media. And when the media asked for response, asked him to comment about it, he himself, Macron, through Munir Mahjoub, this is the name of the guy, he himself pointed to certain files that he himself planted in his own computer, which were false, of course, and very ridiculous in a way. Okay. Some of them had comments in Russian saying, this is not something like we should improve the style, he doesn't sound original. People will not believe it, and things like this. Now the media got the whole information. They saw certain files there that probably are not true, and they didn't know what to do, and they decided not to publish it, but wait for after the elections. This, by the way, tells you that even in the age of technology, creativity is still something that can save you. Now, if you ask me about the second part of this, am I sure that it didn't influence the fake news that we know that were spread through the cyberspace? Didn't influence the voters? I cannot really assure this, but I know that because people, even to the very possibility of fake news, people are much more aware of today. People are not taking blindly everything they hear or see in the networks, all kind of networks. And therefore, I think that probably the whole assessment that you mentioned is true. Now, Israeli side of it, I don't know what you meant, but a lot of technology used here comes from Israel, from Israeli cyber ecosystem, but this is a topic for a different talk, not within the 10 minutes that you gave me. Thank you.
Professor Ben Israel, thank you so much. And our last speaker for today, and we have, I think, Ariel, her young daughter, with us, so that's nice. It really
no, she's leaving. She's leaving.
It expands the generational range of our panel for sure. So our last speaker for today is Dr. Yael Sternhal from the Department of History and the Department of English and American Studies, and she's also the head of the American Studies program here at Tel Aviv University. So Dr. Sternhal, President Trump did everything to undo the legacy, to undo the legacy of President Barack Obama, the first African-American president. He did so domestically and overseas. Further, during his time, racist and anti-Semitic protests were highly salient. African-Americans were pivotal in catapulting Biden to the presidency, both during the primaries and then in the general elections. In your view, what should be the key elements in the agenda of the Biden administration in the context of race in America? Yes, please.
All right, thank you, Udi, and thank you, everyone. It's great to see you all here with us in this event. I titled my talk, The Biden-Harris Agenda on Race, or Where Do We Go From Here? And of course, Where Do We Go From Here is the title of Martin Luther King's 1967 book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos Our Community, which was not a successful book, neither commercially nor critically. Where we are at this particular moment, of course, is the aftermath of Donald Trump's explosive presidency. And this is really one of the kind of the final scenes of the Trump presidency, is a march of right-wing activists, and these are particularly the Proud Boys, which we got to know during the campaign, who descended on Washington, D.C. and set on fire Black Lives Matter signs in churches, and raised all kinds of hell in a way that was pretty difficult to take for residents of DC. So that's one here where I think we are. And then the other here, of course, is the aftermath of a year or a few months during which the US was swept with protests of a scale it has never seen before, concerning social justice, racial inequality, etc., with, of course, the key term of this era, and what perhaps is new and truly meaningful about this wave of protest, other than the kind of sheer scale, is systemic racism. Now, King was also very preoccupied with systemic racism towards the end of his life, as he came to the realization that as important as the achievements of the civil rights movement in the South were, they didn't really make a difference for African Americans outside the South, and that there were systemic problems which Northern Blacks and Western Blacks were dealing with, that the right to vote or the end of segregation in Birmingham, Alabama, didn't actually pertain to. And in this book, he kind of laid out a series of ideas, including the idea that the Negro's problem cannot be solved until the whole of American society takes a new turn toward greater economic justice. And the question that King posed in 1967 of how can that happen, how can that be done, in some ways is the same question that we're asking today. And I would like to focus on the idea of the Biden-Harris administration turning towards greater economic justice, in particular as it pertains to the problems of African Americans. It's kind of remarkable when you think about it that so much has changed, but also so little, right? That the question that he posed 2 minutes after the peak of the civil rights movement are the same questions that we asked, that we're still asking today, and that we're still kind of reconciling ourselves to at this particular moment. So this particular moment is very much, I think, another turning point in the long battle for equality and opportunity for all Americans. And can the Biden-Harris administration make a dent in systemic racism? And can it, in particular, make a dent in racial inequality in economic terms? And these are the terms that I want to focus on. And we're going to take one measurement, because we have 10 minutes, and that's wealth. So wealth is a much more important measure of economic inequality, because salaries can be temporary, whereas wealth is much more permanent, and wealth is in some ways the future, right? I mean, the wealth of a household is the net sum of all its asset minus its debts. So it's a much more meaningful figure than just a salary. I know that for many folks in the States watching, this is all pretty obvious, but I'll lay out a few figures anyway. So this is the median net worth by race or ethnicity during the period of 1989 to 2016. And as you can see, it goes up and down, it fluctuates, But the result for 2016, which is the latest year for which we have figures that we're confident about, is pretty much 10%, meaning African-American households have about 10% of the wealth of white households, 17,000 and change for Black households, and $171,000 for white households. It's a stupendous difference that almost goes without saying, and you cannot console yourself if you care about social justice, if you don't think that a person's course of life should be determined by how dark their skin color is, by the fact that things are not actually getting better, right? So when you look at change over time, you see that 1989, it was 5.5%, meaning the percentage of Black wealth vis-a-vis white wealth. And then it goes up considerably, 1998, right? It's kind of a peak year, 18.8%. And then it starts going down again. It basically collapses. I mean, you can just see African-American households collapse in the aftermath of 2008. And it's a long aftermath, right? Here we're in 2013, then in 2016, we're not where we were yet before the Great Recession. So you can't argue that, things are getting better, as time will solve everything. Time in and of itself doesn't solve anything. Time is neutral. The question is what happens over time. And in this case, not much, as you can tell. Now, then another question that's often asked about this when people try to argue that all will be well in the end without any intervention from the government, and that market forces will right this, is when you control for factors. So college education for African Americans does something, but it doesn't do that much, right? So when you look at the net wealth of households, Black and white, without college, then it's, as you can see, the figures 650 for white households, and then for Black or African American, it's 9,000 and change. So college graduates obviously do much better for both groups, but you can see that the difference is still tremendous, as is the difference in terms of the marital status of the heads of the household, right? Another common argument is that because 2/3 of Black babies are born to single mothers, then poverty is inevitable. But okay, what happens when couples are married? I mean, does that close the wealth gap? It makes things better, for sure. 2 salaries are better than 1, but it does not close the wealth gap. And things are pretty much stable. We are not seeing change over time, and we are not seeing the factors that are normally associated with greater wealth per household actually making the kind of difference that you would think they might make. Now, the reasons for this are well known, I think, to all of us, starting from the fact that African Americans could not get mortgages for decades on end, even in ostensibly liberal locales like New York, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Detroit, you name it. There were mechanisms in place that prevented them from home ownership, which is the single most important vehicle for wealth accumulation in the United States. That's one factor that I think we're all aware of. Another factor is that African American neighborhoods in which more than 10% of the residents are Black tend to experience a drop in real estate values, which is, of course, it's really quite a remarkable figure because it marries the cultural and the material, right? And the question is, what leads to what? How do people's cultural ideas of African Americans factor into real estate prices? And then how does that process work the other way around? But the figures are pretty objective. It's as good as numbers as we can get. Then there are the intangible factors, which we're also aware of. The fact that, let's say, when a white applicant and a Black applicant with identical qualifications apply for a job, then the white applicant has a 36% chance more than a Black person of getting a callback. employers are scared of African Americans, and they're scared of African American men in particular. African American men have the added burden of mass incarceration, since the number of African American men, or let's put it that way, an African American man has 6 times the chance of a white man to spend time in prison. Then not only are the years he spends in prison are wasted years in terms of wealth accumulation, also the rest of that person's life will be shaped by that time that they spend in prison and what it will mean for their employment prospects. So there are a host of factors and reasons. I've named 4. You can probably find 40, but the result is the same. And I'm wondering, in the spirit of Martin Luther King, whether the Biden-Harris administration would be able to take this particular problem on. And what are the policies that the Biden-Harris administration might want to implement in order, I'm not talking about resolution, I'm talking about making a dent. I'm talking about a set of policies that could actually make a difference in less than 200 years, which is, by the way, the exact number that experts put on how long it will take to close the wealth gap without government intervention. Okay, so this is
Dr. Sternhell, 1 minute left, okay? Sorry.
Yeah, so, okay, policies. Encouraging home ownership is key. You know, I put Mitch McConnell here just as a way to highlight the point that Biden and Harris and their entire huge and powerful administration are not alone here. Home ownership will reduce the wealth gap between Blacks and whites by 31%. So that means making a dent, right? That means making a serious dent. Deal with housing segregation, meaning deny funding to communities that are not able to show that they have lowered their rates of housing segregation. Put real penalties on communities that perpetuate the habit, the practice of denying African Americans the ability to move in. Reduce Black people's debt load. For example, from predatory mortgages, from student loans, from car loans. This is something that often goes unacknowledged, but both whites and everyone in the US has a lot of debt, but Blacks have more expensive debt. A car loan is a more expensive form of debt than a mortgage, and African Americans are unable to save because they are married to these highly unequal forms of debt. Improve access to retirement savings. A lot of African Americans do not have retirement savings because they don't work in jobs that offer them this basic right. And what can the federal government do in order to make that happen? And then the last thing that the people who specialize in these areas claim could make a real difference is improve access to banking and to community financial resources, meaning the cornerstone store doesn't need to go to Bank of America to get a loan. It could get a loan from a local institution that would be sensitive to the needs and difficulties facing the owner of an African-American store owner. Now, I'll say one more thing, Udi, and give me—
Really briefly, please.
Whenever the topic of the economic inequality comes up, especially in recent years, then the word reparations sort of bursts into the scene and I think makes a lot of people unable or unwilling to listen. But none of this requires what we think of as direct reparations. And of course, all of us in Israel know exactly what direct reparations mean because we have enjoyed so much of it from Germany. But most of this can be done through federal policies that the federal government has enacted, the likes of which in the past. And so it doesn't require any radical step. It really requires just focus and political will and a historical recognition of what's at stake.
Fantastic. Dr. Sternhell, thank you so much for this spirited argument. And I would like to integrate some of the questions that we're getting from the audience. I'll ask a question of Professor Rabinovich, Professor Epstein, and Professor Ben Israel, one each. And if you can answer in around 30 seconds or maybe a minute, this would be great. So Professor Rabinovich, you said that the Palestinian missed the train. Is there another train coming, or are they going to stay in the station?
Yeah, subway. A train that doesn't go all the way. I think if the sense of realism that I detected materializes, and the Palestinians would be willing to accept interim agreements at this point, they would be accomplishing much. They would be actually putting an end, or at least a stop, to the process of creeping annexation or drift towards one state with that we have seen. They, up until now, categorically refused to settle on anything less than final status agreement. If they are lowering their size, if they lower their sights, they are likely to do better. So
lowering the expectations, lowering the stakes. This was is what might help. Wonderful, thank you, Professor Epstein. Do you buy the argument that this is we went through a watershed event in the politics of appointments with the Amy Coney Barrett's appointment, or do you think this might be an aberration and we're going to go back to the standard?
You know, on the one hand, Udi, the evasion and sidestepping that you mentioned has been a part of Supreme Court confirmation proceedings since Robert Bork in 1986. He said too much, nobody wants to say much. I think you're right, though. No offense to Amy Coney Barrett. Her answers were in some ways rather pedestrian, in part because her background is pretty straightforward. She was a law professor. You look at someone like Elena Kagan. Yes, she was a law professor, but she was dean of Harvard Law School. She worked in the Clinton White House as a domestic advisor, and she was Solicitor General of the United States. Much richer background on which to draw.
Wonderful, thank you so much. And Professor Ben Israel, you basically talked about a triangle of effects, right? Talked about the elites. You remember the Macron campaign and the DNC. You talked about the public, the fact that the public becomes much more sophisticated. And you talked about technology very briefly at the end, suggesting that there's much more to say, but we were out of time. Out of those three elements, if you are thinking about the improvement from 2016 to 2020, where would you put the most? Which of those three corners of the or three angles of the triangle would you think was the most important? The elites, the public, or the technological advancements? You are muted, Itzik. You are muted.
The one which was more improved than the others was the technological. There was certain improvement also on the psychological influence of fake news, because people got used. It's like the COVID. I mean, the more you are hurt by the disease, the more immunity we have at the end of the day. People are more immune today to fake news than they were 5 years or 10 years ago, if you ask for my opinion. No, you are.
Fantastic. Yeah, it was fantastic. Thank you so much to all of you. Dr. Sternhall, you took a little extra, so I'm not going to take the advantage of asking you another question, but it was fascinating. Thank you so much. And I would like to ask Dean Sened to give us his final thoughts and concluding remarks. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you so much. This has been a great pleasure. Very interesting. Definitely standing up to the high expectation we had. I do want to thank Dr. Boris Mintz for his generosity, without which this would not have been possible, and his support over the years, and his genuine interest in this kind of events that is so important to us. And I do alert you to the fact that we will keep this, as Udi suggested at the outset, and are looking forward to have the entire audience in our forthcoming event. In particular, I would like to highlight a planned event to happen in March in collaboration with our wonderful sister institute in Kenya, ISIPE, on the issues of sustainable agriculture and sustainable economics. ISIPE just won one of the most prestigious awards for its contribution to this issue. And we do have actually Dr. Segenet with us this evening. So thank you, everyone. Looking forward to meet you in the next event. And it was really, really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.